Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by the Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Paul Leonardi, co-author with Tsedal, Neeley. The Digital Mindset is the name of the book. The subtitle is What It Really Takes to Thrive in the Age of Data, Algorithms, and AI. It's published by the Harvard Business Review Press and will be released on May 10th. Paul is the Duke of Family Professor of Technology Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's also the founding director of the Master of Technology Management program and well-known in business communities, speaks often. I would suggest his YouTube videos throughout the country and the world. Tsedal is the Naylor Fitzhugh Professor of Business Administration, Senior Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Research Strategy, and Faculty Chair of the Christensen Center for Teaching and Learning at the Harvard Business School. So as I just said to Paul before we began, I'm an old man living, as we all are, in an analog world. Am I able to adopt the digital mindset? And what is a digital mindset? And how would it benefit me to have one? We're not dealing with a professional seminar that he's talking through with people that are his peers. I mean, I can analyze data. I know what an algorithm is. And to dumb down the high concept of the author's 30% rule, I know 30% of a lot of things, a large breadth, but slight depth. And I understand AI in a similar fashion. So what can I achieve in the business world and perhaps in my own life by reading this book? I got a development company with my brothers. I'm a bookseller. I got this. I'm practicing law for 30 some years. So Paul tells me and you, the reader, why, as we move through corporate or technological careers without this viewpoint, we'll struggle with new concepts, business direction, and the ability to succeed in a dynamic and challenging business environment. So welcome, Paul, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. So as I said, I own a bookstore, and the first thing a reader does, without exception, when they look at my front table, is to analyze the titles and, more importantly, covers. So I always think that's important, especially since you and your publisher spend a lot of time thinking about it. So let's use that as a starting off point, especially with the title and the subtitle, but also with regard to the 9 multicolored cubes.
Okay.
You want to show the book, or should I?
If you've got a copy, please show it. That'd be great.
Okay, here it is. I'll back up a little bit. So you can't read it completely, but you can see what I'm talking about, the way these cubes are here, and they certainly do have a relationship to the topics that we'll be talking about today. So give it a shot.
Sure. Well, probably the best place to start is by defining what we mean by digital mindset. And that'll help to answer some of the questions that you have about why did we come up with the title that we did and why does the cover look the way that it did? So when I think about a mindset, typically the way that we approach it is that a mindset is a way of thinking and acting in the world. And social psychologists and cognitive psychologists have talked about mindsets for a long time. You probably read Carol Dweck's book on the growth mindset. There lots of people have discussed the importance of developing different kinds of mindsets that help us to see and act differently in the world. And what we really encountered as we have been working over the last 2 decades with people from all different kinds of businesses, in all different kinds of industries, is that everybody seems to really understand that the world is changing. We're using so many more tools than we ever have in the past, that data are becoming increasingly important. But when we ask people, well, what does it mean to go through a digital transformation or have, use digital technologies and data to change your work or your behaviors in any meaningful way? Most people would tell us, I don't really know. Like, I hear this idea of be digital all the time, but I'm not quite sure what that means. Now, that's not everybody, of course, but that's most of the people that we talk to across lots of businesses. There are a subset of folks who seem to really be able to take advantage of digital technologies, take advantage of data, see new opportunities, develop new products, new services for their companies, and really thrive in the digital age. And that was really the motivation for us to write this book, is to say, well, what are these people seeing that everyone else is not seeing the same way? So our research really, and in our work with companies, was really geared at trying to understand, how do you develop a way of seeing that takes advantage of these digital capabilities that we have? And the sort of prisms that you see on the cover of the book reflect that idea that as you look through different lenses in different ways and light refracts, you see the same issue look differently in multiple ways. And that's really what a mindset's about at its heart, I think, is taking a set of lenses and being able to see a problem in a new way. And the reason that there are 3 rows of those is because we argue in the book that there are 3 approaches that you need to develop to have an effective digital mindset. And we call those approaches to collaboration, approaches to computation, and an approach to change. And the overall argument of the book at its highest level is that if you can develop a set of skills that help you to see differently, you'll begin to approach your collaborations differently. You'll be able to approach how you deal with data and what we call computation differently. And you'll think about change differently. And once you do those things, then you're going to be ready to really succeed in the digital era.
And those 3 discrete topics are really well covered. And I don't ask the same questions you're going to get asked from the professional community, because, well, also the glossary and the charts are also very helpful.
Good.
But yeah. I'm going to be asking questions as a layman, because just like, say, Neil deGrasse is writing books for laymen about the origin of the universe, you're doing the same thing. I mean, as genres go, I'm going to be putting this in the business section, but the people, I hope, will be accessing it are as much neophytes as they are professionals.
Yeah, that's my hope as well.
Yeah, if you look at it, like, say, take a vinyl record, it's analog. It contains all the information that was contained in the performance, but it's going to degrade over time and repetition. Whereas digital information in ones and zeros may not cover the entire spectrum of notes and tones, but it will never degrade, ever.
That's right.
So, but I get along okay. So let's assume that I am, and I have been, whether it's, my son knows every metric that when he uses Excel, he can drill down. When he makes one change, obviously it propagates through the entire
metric. And he
probably
develops his macros so that everything is automated really smoothly.
Yeah, and he and my brother argue. Bob says, fly by the seat of your pants, use intuition, the exact opposite of what you're saying. And Michael is following the rule that you are proposing with regard to all 3 of those sections. So the question, I guess, I would next ask, because I don't want to do all the talking, which you got to stop me because I will, okay. Is your 30% rule. Let's start there.
Sure. So a lot of people have trepidation about developing any kind of skill that would allow them to, that seems like it's technical in nature. I work at University of California, Santa Barbara in the College of Engineering. Engineers breathe and swim in numbers and math, right? That's not what normal people breathe and swim in, right? We swim in symbols, and we swim in metaphors, and we swim in analogies. And for most people, developing some sense of what is happening under the hood of a piece of software or a machine appears pretty complex and often daunting. And we wondered when we began this project, what level of technical skill or sophistication do people need to achieve in order to really have a good digital mindset, to be able to build that way of seeing, those lenses that we talked about? And we were concerned that, well, is it going to be too much? Are we asking everybody to become a computer programmer to be successful, in the digital age? And people were asking us the same questions, frankly, right? Like, do I need to learn how to code? Do I need to go back to school? And do I need to learn Python or Ruby on Rails? Whatever the top application is at the moment. And we said, well, this is something we actually need to spend some time researching and really thinking about. And the more research we did about this topic, the more it became clear that what's really needed to thrive in the digital era is conversational ability around these different topics. Having a sense or an understanding of what's happening inside a piece of software, what an algorithm generally is doing, how to interpret statistical results that people might present to you, how to think about the features or characteristics of digital tools when you're collaborating with people that don't work or live in the same geographic location that you do. These aren't skills that we need to be experts in, but they're skills that we need to develop so that we can understand what's happening and make smart decisions. The analogy that we use in the book that really sort of set it home for me is, Tsedal has spent a lot of time studying language and how language is used in companies around the world. And I was a Spanish major as an undergrad in college and spent a lot, and I speak a couple other languages, and spent time learning, right, what it's like to be proficient in a foreign language. And what the research says is that, at least in a business context, that if you have about 12,000 words or so, you have almost native speaker level fluency in a language. But at about 3,500 words, you're proficient to be able to converse and interact with people and get along just fine. So that's about 30% of the total. That's the analogy that I like to use in thinking about our 30% rule, is that you need to sort of know enough to be dangerous, but you don't have to have skills in programming. You don't have to be a data scientist. You don't have to understand all the intricacies of cybersecurity or how to lead a big, large organizational change, but you need to understand what are the activities that other people are doing. You need to be able to understand what's happening inside a software application that is giving me data so that I can ask the right questions of it. And if you can build those skills, you can get to that 30%, then you have the basic foundation essentially to have that lens that you can see through and see the world in a different way. And not only do we find that that 30% is pretty achievable, and what we try to do in the book is to say, if you don't have that 30%, these chapters are going to get you there. But that developing that 30% is actually kind of fun, because like learning a foreign language, you begin to interact with people in new ways and you begin to see different possibilities for your actions. And that's really gratifying. So that's what that 30%, we call it the 30% rule, is really all about. It's don't be too scared that you're not going to be able to develop the right kind of skills. You can, but that it's also important to remember that while skills are necessary, they're not the same thing as a digital mindset. Skills allow you to have the frameworks to see, but they're not seeing themselves.
Yeah, it's funny because one way that I kind of began to understand this is you talk, and you've talked in other talks about this, you're talking about conversation, paying attention,
Right.
convincing leadership, and getting off your ass and doing it at the end.
Exactly.
And that's interesting because those are just as analog as everything we do when we wake up and brush our teeth and go to work. So that really, you're not saying, hey, you don't have to change the way you live. You don't have to change and feel like you're living, that your virtual reality is the real reality. All you're doing, well, it's a great deal of what you're doing, is attempting to provide tools.
Exactly.
Correct? Yeah.
And a friend of mine from high school that I was talking to recently about the book said, "Oh, I saw you got a book coming out. So are you gonna?" And I saw the title. Does that mean that you're going to tell me that I need to go back to school and I need to take a computer science degree and that I need to buy all kinds of new fancy gadgets around my house, and that's what's going to make me successful, as we move into the future in a world that's increasingly digital? And to your point, the answer is a resounding no. What we need to understand is the different ways that technologies are being deployed, how people are making decisions using the data that those technologies collect and categorize and use to make predictions. And we don't have to change our way of living. We just have to take these new capabilities that are available and understand them well enough and in a way that's going to enable us to really be effective citizens in the global economy.
Do you think you take this mindset home with you?
I do. I certainly think about it a lot at home. And in particular, when it comes to data. So I'll give you an example of one of the stories that we tell in the book that I really love a lot. And it comes from some work by colleagues at UC Irvine. And they were doing a study about incidence of heart disease in Japan. And what they found was that there were extremely low rates of heart disease being reported in Japan over a long period of time. And there were a number of speculations as to why this might be the case, including regular exercise, the climate, the Japanese diet. But once they began to dig deeper and deeper into the data, what they uncovered was that there were people that were presenting many symptoms that looked exactly like heart attacks, but those symptoms were being classified as strokes rather than heart attacks. And the reason was that they uncovered was that heart attack is a very low status illness to get in the Japanese culture. And that it's much more high status to suffer a stroke than it is to get a heart attack. And so many of these symptoms that in the US would present, or the Western world, right, would present themselves as heart attack symptoms, present themselves, at least in categorization terms, as stroke symptoms. Now, if you look at this record, you could start to make very spurious conclusions about the relationship between diet and lack of incidence of heart disease in Japan. But it all really comes down to how those initial signals are being categorized. I use that insight all the time in my life, right? Anytime I'm applying for a loan at a bank, right? Anytime my kids get a report card coming home that says what percentile they fall into on their reading level, I really think, how are the data actually being collected and how are they being categorized to reach this conclusion that somebody's presenting to me? And when I do that, I can start to ask smarter questions. I can go to my school principal if I need to, right? And say, well, you're making this recommendation, but the way you classify the data maybe wouldn't lead to that recommendation. Is that true? Oh boy, I sound like an annoying father. I don't really do that kind of thing. I'm just giving it an example. But those are the kinds of activities and actions that you can do if you understand that data are not some natural substance that exists out in the world. They're social products, right? We harness something natural like the wind, and we harness it through a technology like a thermometer. And a thermometer has a categorization scheme associated with it, right? Fahrenheit or Celsius, and it moves weather in degrees. But there are other ways to think about the weather. We can think about how humid it is. We have a different technology that captures that, right? A barometer. So there are all different kinds of devices that are making sense of the world, the physical world, the natural world, the social world in some way. They're being classified, those data are being then classified and recorded. And the more that we understand that flow, right, from how things are collected to how they end up at me to make some prediction. When I ask Siri what the weather's going to be this morning and she tells me I should wear a jacket, she's making a prediction based on some kind of data that was collected in some way, was categorized in a particular way. And my action, if I just blindly follow Siri, could be a poor action if I don't really do my due diligence to understand why that recommendation was made the way it was. That's part of what it is to develop a digital mindset, I think, right? It's to recognize that you have options and possibilities, but only if you can understand the sequence of activities that occurred, in this case of forming data and recommendations, and then you can make the decisions that are best for you.
Your analogy brings me to ask a question that it's probably unfair, but suppose you are exactly right. You've analyzed the data with regard to your son's performance, and you know how he actually performs because he's your son, and you see. Right. But the principal's a jackass and he's living in the past and he just says no. So, and I wouldn't ask this, but for the fact that you do talk about convincing leadership.
That's right.
And so what if you do the best job you can, or you have a boss that takes credit for what you do well and blames you for what you do poorly? I'm not saying you even have to solve that, or it's your duty to solve that. But are there any tips about, once you achieve this mindset, how do you influence other people positively with regard to that?
Well, one thing that I often see happen wouldn't happen with my school principal, who's a great guy, by the way, if you're watching this. But if you are in a business context, often what we see is that a lot of times let me back up for a second. we're increasingly moving into a world, as you mentioned in your introduction, where people want to make decisions based on data. And they will tell you often that intuition's out, data are in. We can talk about whether I actually believe that's true in a minute, which I don't, right? And we can chat about that. But that certainly is the way that the world is moving, certainly the business world, right? We make decisions based on good data. Now, a lot of those decisions that are being based on data are being based on the results of some kind of analysis of those data. And, there's a great quote from the Bible, right? That the devil can cite scripture for his purpose, right? And Mark Twain called statistics, there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics, right? The numbers can be, I won't say bent in any way, but they can be interpreted in many, many different ways. And what we see very frequently is that even people that are responsible for making decisions based on data, senior leadership in an organization, often don't have the skills to really understand the basis of that recommendation based on the statistical analyses that were run on it. And that's why we spend some time in the book doing kind of like, I wouldn't even call it statistics 101, right? It's like super basic. It's like statistics 1001. That it's really, really trying to help you to see that, someone might say this is a significant result, but it may not actually be significant if you look at the confidence intervals. And if you don't even know what a confidence interval is, you wouldn't know to ask that question. So to get back to your example, if my school principal was saying, well, that's the data, that's the way it is, I bet there's a fairly high likelihood that that principal may not really understand how to interpret the data. Some software program has spit it out and said, your child falls in the 85th percentile or wherever, but does it fall in the 85th percentile in a way that makes sense for the kind of data we're analyzing or the suggestions that you want to make about pedagogical choices for your kid? That's how I think you start to make better decisions about, or you get to be involved in better ways of persuading your managers, right? Is by helping them to understand the parameters of the statistics, by helping them to understand what kind of analysis is maybe most appropriate based on the data that are being presented. And to say, based on what we know, here are the reasonable conclusions that we can draw. And what we actually find, which is really good news, is that many people that are in those decision-making situations love to take a step back. Yes, they want to make a decision based on data, but they also want to be sure that they're making the right decision based on data. And the more that you can help them to see how the analysis is going to lead to a good decision, the happier they typically are with that outcome. So I think that's one way of gaining some kind of regaining agency, let's say, in the way that you're describing.
Well, let me, I'm writing down notes here. If I look down, I'm writing down notes. Here's another one of my curmudgeon questions.
Sure.
So like a while ago, they changed speedometers in cars to digital ones. And you could see you're going 67 miles per hour. And then it only lasted 5 years and they went back to an analog speedometer. Why? Because people didn't know it. They didn't want to know what speed they were going. They wanted to know where they were, where they're going, and the acceleration or deceleration. So what's your answer to that? They just took away the digital. They didn't want to develop the digital mindset.
Well, I think I would make a distinction there between what's actually going on behind the scenes in the computer that masquerades as a car these days, and the presentation of that data, right? So I feel exactly the same way. I have a digital speedometer in my car. Well, I have an option of having it digital, or it's actually digital, but it looks analog, right? And I always change it to the analog setting. I don't want to see the numbers moving, because that display of that information is not really helpful to me in my real-time decision-making. Okay, now I'm hoping the Highway Patrol is not listening, but I don't really care how fast I'm going. I want to generally know how fast I'm going as I'm driving, right? So I know if I'm in the ballpark of what I think is reasonable and safe in this particular area. But all that data that's flashing at me is way too much of a distraction. Now, I think that represents an inefficient or a bad or a poor assessment of what does a driver actually need when the driver is driving. And the data that you just described are the kind of data that I think people typically want when they're driving because it helps them to be a better driver. That doesn't mean, though, that the entire computer behind that screen is not still calculating and being very, very clear on exactly how fast you're going. And remember, insurance companies these days are taking huge advantage of that in ways that you could say are both good and bad. One way that they're doing it is by, if you enable their chip in the vehicle, they can begin to track exactly how fast you're going and how quickly you accelerate or decelerate at a particular time, to then put those data into some model that will predict whether you're likely to get into a car crash or not. The good news on that front is that you're likely to, if you're a safe driver, get a better insurance rate than you would have before, right? When all they did was look at your demographic, your age, and the city you live in, and put you in an actuarial table of some kind, essentially, right? And then determine that we should charge you way too much money for your auto insurance. The flip side of that, though, which we discuss in the book too, is that you're increasingly monitored and quantified all the time. And so now your insurance company knows how fast you're going and you're driving in the car, how long before that potentially becomes integrated with your search habits on the web and your eating habits at a restaurant via how you booked your meal on OpenTable or whatever it was. So there are, no matter what display we're getting in the vehicle has become a computer, and we're doing all kinds of things with it that we need to understand so that we can make choices about maybe how fast we drive or what kind of vehicles we buy, or if we stick to bikes instead of cars.
Yeah. You know why I can tell that's a good answer? Because it changed my mind.
Good.
That's how you can always tell.
That's great. I'm glad.
So you mentioned restaurants, and it's perfect because I just got off the phone with a friend of mine who's talking about opening a restaurant. And he was talking about, well, should I do it or shouldn't I do it? And then we got to talking about, well, should I do like these, it's called Harvest or something, where you order from the computer. And he was talking about, if I order from the computer, I can eliminate the cashier. And so there's two different kinds of decision-making processes here, strategic and essentially tactical. The strategic question is, should I open the restaurant at all?
Right.
And then you drill down to these things, supply chain, labor, and all that. So there's two different ways to approach this, at least in my mind. Right? Or no?
So I'm trying to link that back to the digital screens for ordering, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're talking about like the customer coming in and ordering with the digital screens.
Yeah,
right?
there's like 5 different panels.
Yeah.
And you can add your dressing, you can add all the condiments. So no one has to take it all down. You can do it exactly the way you want to do it.
Right. Yeah. Well, my initial thought about that is that it's a really crappy interface and customer service way of dealing in a restaurant, right? I don't go to a restaurant for efficiency. I go to a restaurant for diversion. I want to go and sit and be in the beautiful environment with great ambiance and good food that I couldn't cook at home and good company, right, that is out to celebrate. So I hate the screens personally. Are they more efficient in the restaurant context? I don't know. I haven't really seen a study on that. What I could imagine, though, would be quite useful is to make sure that you have accurate, up-to-date information on orders that is systematized in a way that allows you to do more efficient purchasing, to make sure that you have the stock that you need or want on a particular day or date. And I think that I know that there are some companies that develop great models that allow you to make those kinds of predictions in the restaurant industry, right? What that does require is fastidious bookkeeping. It's not something that you couldn't do analog. You certainly could, right? So if you have a server come over, right, with a pad of paper and they're writing down your orders, and if they just go like as a short order place and you put it on the rack and the short order cook cooks, you never have those data stored anywhere to be able to analyze and access and use for better ordering, like you were suggesting. But most servers these days go to some computer terminal, right? And they plug in your order, and all of those data about your food preferences gets captured. Now, the advantage of doing that is not necessarily, right, that the restaurant itself runs more efficiently in the moment, but it's that you can then take those data and get a sense of, okay, on an average Tuesday night in April, we serve 42 chicken breasts. And so we need to make sure that we're ordering the right kinds and quantity of food to make sure we're meeting the demand and not oversupplying so that the food goes bad, right? And we have waste, but that we're meeting exactly the demand. That's, I think, the power of where data becomes very useful. But one mistake, I think, would be if you're in the kind of dining establishment that people are going to for the reason I just suggested, right? Which is you're going for the ambiance and everything, that you throw screens at people all over the place and you tell them, hey, order and do this yourself. No. A much more low-tech approach to customer service can help make sure that the customers feel comfortable and they want to come back, but then some kind of high-tech approach later, right, to inputting that data and analyzing them can then be very useful, I think, for the overall operational success of the restaurant. So
yeah, the reason why the reason why the book is so good is because you just did the same thing. I'm looking at it. Oh, the monitors are digital.
Right.
That has nothing to do with the decision-making process. Now I understand that too. So the other thing is like, but after the meal, if they bring you a little modular thing and you sign your check, right, that's a good idea. Right? You just
I think so, right? It cuts out a lot of potential fraud. It allows for the transaction to happen right then and there. It's much quicker, exactly, right? Nobody wants to hang around for an hour after they eat, right, to get the bill. And so that moves things much faster. But I really appreciate you highlighting this point that, it's easy to think about in the digital age that what you need is a bunch of tech, right? You need all of these digital tools and that we should be automating everything. Our answer to that, as you pointed out, right, is a resounding no way in hell. That should not be what happens. What we really need to be thinking about is what are the right kinds of technologies that are going to allow us to accomplish the kinds of activities, goals, strategies that we want to accomplish. And I am really a strong believer that the minimal digital interface required is the best solution. But then you really need to make sure that you're understanding, are we capturing the right kind of data? Do I know even what the available technologies are? These different digital tools have different ways of processing those data, or they have different ways of categorizing. And I can make my selection if I understand that in ways that serve my goals even better. And I think that's what we try to get at in the book.
Another good example, at least in my mind, and one they teach in business school, is when they came out with New Coke. And they were worried about Pepsi doing this and that. Yeah. And then they did all their metrics, they did all their surveys, they did everything that you might suggest, but they were completely wrong. And they had a backpedal. It was embarrassing. They lost money. So what went wrong there?
Well, we don't discuss New Coke specifically, but we discuss this kind of issue in the chapter that we have on experimentation. And one thing that, if you look at the sort of chronicles of business history, there are lots of examples like the one you just suggested, where a company went all in on a particular kind of product or service, and it turned out nobody wanted it, or it didn't work well, and there was huge upheaval from the users or the customers. That the risk of doing that is heightened in the digital world. And I think that the reason is that the tools move so quickly that it's often really difficult for us to know, how are people going to respond to this kind of technology? How are they going to respond to this particular kind of service? Are they going to use it the way that we think? And boy, if you spend all that time and development money like Coke did to come out with New Coke and develop all the marketing collateral associated with it and roll it out and it bombs, you are sunk, right? Because it's not like there's just one big competitor, Pepsi, right, who you're fighting with. You have all of these upstarts. You have so many different kinds of organizations, right, that are building new digital tools that are really easy to iterate with and develop and put out into the field. So you have to, as part of your digital mindset, develop a capability for being able to experiment with those kinds of products. To say, this is our best guess at what we think is going to work based on some research we've done, based on the profile of our users or consumers. And we're going to try it out. We're going to run some analyses. in software, they call these A/B tests that they run online. When Google gives you one homepage and me a different homepage to test who clicks where and for what reasons. That kind of ethos of experimentation is just going to be so important to make sure that we're developing things that people need, that they can use, that are meaningful to them, and from a business standpoint, that we don't get completely upstaged by the next competitor who is, just a fraction ahead of us in the development and can totally wipe us out.
You talk about, well, that's a perfect example is Coke, because you talk about in the book dividends. Essentially, okay, so at first I thought, oh, this is so Machiavellian. Always, the dividends are just money, just like they would be to a stockholder. But that's not what dividends really are. I mean, it's a part of it, I assume. Yes, it is a part of it, correct?
Sure.
But it's not all of it.
Right.
And yeah, actually, one of the reviewers kind of quips, if you want to learn the difference between blockchain and bitmap. But that's not all it is. I mean, I don't want to keep pushing you, but that's not all it is, right?
No, it's not all it is. Like we said at the beginning, right, when we first started our conversation today, developing some of that skill is important, right? And you need to know the difference between blockchain and bitmap, and you should know what blockchain does, because there are many ways that blockchain can be useful to your business, and there are many ways that it could not be useful to your business. You should understand, right, how algorithms operate. You should understand the basics of statistics, like we discussed, but that's a piece. The bigger part of it is understanding how you apply these kinds of technologies and use these kinds of data that the technologies produce in your lives and in your businesses and in the social world. Like I said that before, that data are not out there waiting to be discovered. They're produced by us. Technologies come to have their meaning in interaction, right? When we use them. Your example that you began with of your son using Excel is a very different tool for your son than it probably is for you, right?
Yes,
because
it's an extension of his body.
Yeah. And it's in large part because he uses it differently than you do, right? And he uses it differently, probably because he has some different skills than you do, but also because he has different needs than you do, right? That have helped hone those, that have encouraged him to hone those skills to approach Excel in a certain way. And so the tool you're using could be called, Mexcel, and the tool he's using could be called Lexcel, right? They're like different tools almost in how they're used and enacted in people's everyday practice. And that's a big part of what our focus is in the book, right? Is that part of your job as a good citizen in the digital age, and your job as a leader of an organization that is moving through these kinds of digital changes, is to figure out the right ways to incorporate those kinds of digital tools and the capabilities they provide into your ongoing streams of action, right? The things that you do in your regular life, the important projects that are happening in your organization. And some of that, at least at the organization level, really involves making good cultural changes within your organization, right? That helps people recognize that change is constant. And, you're going to use tool A today and tool B tomorrow and tool C the day after that, probably, because that's the way the world is. And to get comfortable that we don't have, we no longer live in a world that is like mostly stable, punctuated by small episodes of change. We live in a world that's constantly changing, and orienting to that is really part of a digital mindset.
One area of the book that we haven't touched upon yet, but it's very important, and lots of other people address it, but use somewhat differently, is the concept of protection.
Yeah.
Protecting not only your investment in your company, but protecting your data and your own security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the typical way that people approach cybersecurity, at least people that write about it, I think is too scary. Like, it's too daunting. It's all about like, well, what are the kinds of security protocols we need as we're developing products and services, and how do we make sure that they're certified in the right kinds of ways? And then for users, the recommendations are always like banal. Change your password often, right? And don't share sensitive data with people you don't know. So we decided to take a slightly different approach, and that was to say that digital tools are very different in many ways than analog tools in that they're difficult to protect. And one of the analogies that we like to use is about thinking about a castle. And Jan Chong, who's vice president of a fintech company called Tally, gave us this example. And she said, when I talk to my stakeholders, even though this is a technology business, a lot of them think that you can secure your software like you can secure a castle. So you fortify the walls and you make sure that you only have a couple of entrances and exits that are very strategic and they're well protected, and you dig a moat around it, and then you're going to be fine. The problem in the digital world, though, is that a piece of software is not like a castle. And that's because you don't own the ground that the castle sits on, and that the walls of the castle are constantly moving around, right, as the software gets updated. And you put your app into the app store, and the app ecosystem is like that ground, and it's owned by Apple. It's not owned by you. And so there's all kinds of ways that software can get disconnected from other pieces of software in the ecosystem. And as it's being constantly updated and changed, the things that we thought were secure are now no longer going to be secure. We give a number of examples in the book about if you would sort of adopt this way of thinking, what you can do on a development standpoint to try to protect your software better. But the important thing, I think the most important thing, is to recognize that there's going to be a security problem at some point. And we give several examples in the book of very highly fortified systems that had major security problems. They're going to happen. And that's part of the digital mindset, is recognizing that you can't control it all. And the best thing to do is to try to stay on top of your software development, to try to stay on top of keeping things secure, right, in terms of your passwords and all that, such that when a problem, you can stave off problems for longer, but when they happen, you have a concrete strategy and a set of actions that you can take to deal with that problem, rather than not assembling that, that SWAT team ahead of time and hoping that the siege never was going to occur.
Yeah, I mean, that's even for human resources people, that's a perfect, I'm thinking of all kinds of scenarios. Yeah, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
A good way to conclude, how better to conclude than with Albert Einstein? And I love epigraphs, again, as a bookseller.
Yeah, me
and
too.
your epigraph, if you indulge me to read it, it is from Albert Einstein, and it says, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." And that's profound, but I never would have thought that that would be something that would be fundamental. And it is, right?
It is. Yeah.
People choose their epigraphs very carefully.
Yeah. And
That's
we
why I like
certainly,
reading them.
yeah. And for us, that quote by Einstein really resonated, because the message of the book is that anybody can develop a digital mindset. What it takes is the courage and the humility to begin to think differently. And thinking differently doesn't just happen on its own. We use concepts, we use frameworks, we use linguists tell us we use words to think, right? We think with things. We think through frameworks. We think through lenses. And to develop a digital mindset that allows you to change the way you approach the world, you do need to develop some skills. You do need to practice understanding concepts like the ones we've discussed. And what those allow you to do are to develop those kinds of approaches to collaboration, computation, and change that will help you to see differently. And when you see differently, you can think differently and act differently. And now you're in a whole new world. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, and it's a good place to stop. Thanks so much. I've been talking to Paul Leonardi, co-author of The Digital Mindset. And as I said, I have the luxury of being able to have this book in the bookstore on May 10th. And I have the luxury, and hopefully Paul will get the benefit in part from me being able to sell it now, because I know so much about it that I second guessed at first. And like I said, the way I look at a good book is not only to change a person's mind, but also to leave them asking questions of themselves and figuring out, wait, what am I going to do with the information, rather than just ending the book and, okay, it's done. And I think that's what you guys have done. So
That's
thanks so
wonderful
much
to
for
hear.
doing that.
That's been our goal. Thanks. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
I agree. I hope I'll talk to you soon.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye.